Some of the deepest and most meaningful discussions happen when we are able to relate to what others are saying, which means that sharing our faith is very often about understanding our own stories, understanding others' stories, and then finding Christ at their intersection. That's understanding our own stories, understanding other people's stories, and then finding Christ at the intersection. And one of the conclusions we've come to over the years that we've spent helping other people to share their faith is that one of the reasons we often find evangelism so hard is because we don't actually know our own stories very well. And therefore, it's no surprise that we have trouble finding out where our stories intersect with the stories of other people. And one reason we don't know our stories well is because we tend to tell our story in one way and the same way, regardless of the conversational context and regardless of who we're conversing with. For many of us, at some point, we were probably told that every good story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And so we were instructed to write out our testimony to conform to this framework of life before Christ, encounter with Christ, and then life after Christ. And so we've told it that same way ever since, thinking that this kind of 2 to 3 minute spiel is our single testimony. Now, don't get me wrong, that testimony has proven invaluable many times, and I've often told it that way, and God has used it. And yet, the truth is that each of us has innumerable testimonies of how God has worked in our lives. We're not just limited to one. Quite the opposite, we limit the effectiveness of our evangelism when we restrict ourselves to only one way of sharing when God has been at work in countless ways. One way of gaining a deeper understanding of our own stories that we've found extremely useful is to write out your testimony along various themes. You can start by identifying a theme under which it would be important for you to understand your testimony, and then spend some time praying and reflecting on how that theme has played out in your life and how God has been at work through it. And you can even ask others how they've seen that theme play in your life. It's amazing some of the responses that question can get. The more themes through which we know our testimony, the better, because then the more natural it will be to connect with the stories of others, regardless of which themes are most strongly present in their story. To give you just a few examples of the kind of themes that we're talking about, how about forgiveness, family, suffering, intellect, relationships, guilt, death, fear, dreams, failure, success, purpose, loneliness, freedom, pride, worry, anxiety, shame, frustrations with the church, conflict, decisions about the future, image, identity, the list could just go on. For most of us, we always tell our testimony along the same theme or two, but the truth is that God has been renewing us in all of these different respects. And so the more thoroughly we understand our story along a variety of themes, the better we'll be at connecting meaningfully with the stories of others, as we'll be able to naturally recognize more intersections between our stories and their stories, and then to find Christ at that intersection. It really hit home for me how significant it was that I be able to tell my story in a way that related to others' pain points when I was in college, and a friend who I'd been wanting to have a spiritual conversation with for years, but always struggled to connect because he was very close to it. He came up to me while we were all revising for our final exams, and he shared that he was overwhelmed by stress and had noticed that I never seemed that stressed out, but still had quite a lot of joy. And he asked me how I did it. And I suddenly realized that he was that intersection in our stories that I had been praying for, as I was able to share with him that I wasn't all that stressed out, because even though I wanted to do well, my identity wasn't going to be determined by whether I succeeded or failed, and my worth wasn't going to be based on how high my scores were, because I already had found this identity in God who loved me, even at my worst, even when I totally failed. And so I didn't need to impress God to prove myself worthy of his love, and that meant I sure didn't need to impress anybody else to be found worthy of them either. And when it comes to getting to know our own stories, Vince and I actually approach this in 3 ways. We do it by identifying themes, as I've already shared. And then we do it by thinking back to specific ages or seasons of our lives. For example, how was God at work in my life when I was a young child? What about in high school or during my early years of adulthood? What about in this last season? And thirdly, we do it through the specific lens of relationships by reflecting on questions like, how has God been shaping me through my relationship with my mum? Or how has he been working in my life through my various friendships? Or what is he teaching me about himself through my interactions with my small children? Themes, ages, and relationships. These are all helpful ways to get to know how God is at work in our stories. One of the ways that we create space to do this is by building this kind of reflection into our prayer times with God. The other fantastic thing I love about doing this is that as I come to better understand my own story, it brings me to a place of far greater wonder and gratitude towards God, as it helps me to recognize that the various ways that he's been renewing my life are so much richer and deeper and more comprehensive than any one version of my testimony. So how about you? What if you took some time with the Lord just to ask him to reveal to you something new about your testimony along one of those three areas? It could be along a different theme that you haven't thought about your testimony in before. Perhaps it could be a certain age in your life, asking God how he was at work in that season. Or perhaps it's through a particular relationship. Why don't you just go away, spend some time with him and ask him to show you what he's been doing in your life and how you might tell your story in a fresh way. I truly think you'll find it incredibly encouraging.